February 1977. A black man in a fur coat stares from the cover of New York magazine with 3 words that would seal his fate: Mr. Untouchable. Nicky Barnes didn't just run Harlem's heroin trade. He weaponized a philosophy written by a Florentine diplomat 5 centuries earlier, turned it into a criminal empire worth over $50 million, and proved that the most dangerous education isn't found in universities. It's found in understanding how power actually works when you strip away the comfortable lies society tells itself. Here's what they won't teach you in any classroom. The Prince, Machiavelli's masterwork, isn't a book about politics. It's a manual for survival in systems designed to devour you. And Nicky Barnes, a kid from Harlem who watched his father abandon his family, who saw his mother work herself to exhaustion for pennies, who learned that the world rewards predators and punishes the naive. He understood something most people spend their entire lives denying. The game is rigged. The question isn't whether you'll play. The question is whether you'll play to win or play to lose while pretending you're virtuous. Barnes grew up in the South Bronx in Harlem during the 1940s and 50s, an environment where survival wasn't a metaphor. It was a daily calculation. His early years were marked by the kind of betrayals that reshape a mind permanently. His father left. The men around him who preached loyalty disappeared when it mattered. The legitimate path, the one society promised would lead to security, that path led his mother to a life of exhaustion and poverty despite doing everything right. Barnes watched this, he processed it, and he came to a conclusion that would define everything that followed. The system itself is the betrayal. This is where most people misunderstand the criminal mind. They think it's about greed or violence or some moral deficiency. That's the comfortable narrative. The truth is far more disturbing. Barnes didn't reject morality because he was broken. He rejected it because he saw, with absolute clarity, that conventional morality is a control mechanism designed to keep certain people compliant while others exploit them. When you're born into a world that has already decided you're disposable, playing by rules that were never written to protect you isn't noble, it's suicidal. The streets taught Barnes his first Machiavellian principle before he ever opened the book. Trust is a weapon people use against you. Every time he saw someone extend genuine loyalty, he watched them get destroyed for it. Every time someone showed vulnerability, showed love, showed faith in another person, that opening became the knife wound. The addicts he saw weren't just chemically dependent. They were emotionally dependent. They trusted the high, they trusted the dealer, they trusted tomorrow would be different, and that trust was the chain that bound them. When Barnes eventually encountered the Prince, it wasn't an intellectual exercise, it was recognition. Machiavelli was describing the world Barnes already inhabited, but with the precision of a surgical manual. Here was a text that didn't moralize, it didn't pretend. It simply stated what works and what doesn't when you're operating in an environment where power is the only currency that matters. And Barnes, with the kind of intelligence that gets wasted in conventional systems, began to apply these principles with methodical precision. Better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. This wasn't philosophy to Barnes, this was operational doctrine. In the drug trade, love is a liability. Love makes you predictable. Love creates obligations. Love gives your enemies a map to your vulnerabilities. But fear, properly calibrated fear, creates a perimeter nothing can penetrate. Barnes built his reputation on calculated displays of ruthlessness, not random violence, not emotional outbursts. Strategic demonstrations that communicated a simple message: the cost of crossing me exceeds any potential benefit. The Council Barnes organization of 7 black kingpins operated like a corporation built on terror. But here's the sophistication most people miss. Barnes understood that fear isn't about constant violence. That's amateur hour. That's wasteful. True fear is about certainty. When people know, with absolute conviction, that specific actions will produce specific consequences, you don't need to enforce constantly. The fear enforces itself. Barnes would make examples, carefully chosen examples, that sent ripples through the entire ecosystem. One act of overwhelming response to a betrayal, and hundreds of people recalibrate their behavior without you lifting another finger. Never show your intentions. This principle became Barnes' operational security. The drug trade is an information war. Law enforcement, rivals, even your own organization. Everyone is trying to predict your next move. Barnes compartmentalized everything. His lieutenants knew their piece, never the whole picture. His distribution networks were deliberately convoluted, with layers of misdirection built in. When the DEA thought they were tracking his main supply line, they were chasing a decoy. When they thought they understood his territory, he'd already shifted the architecture. This is pure Machiavellian. The prince who telegraphs his strategy is the prince who gets overthrown. Barnes ran multiple operations simultaneously, each one potentially a feint for the others. He'd let law enforcement score small victories, calculated sacrifices that made them think they were winning, while the real infrastructure remained untouched. He understood that in any conflict, the side that controls information flow controls outcomes. His people didn't talk because they didn't know. You can't reveal what you were never told. Use the weakness of others. Here's where Barnes' operation became truly dark. Machiavelli wrote about exploiting the vulnerabilities of rival princes and their states. Barnes applied this to an entire ecosystem of human weakness. Addicts weren't customers, they were leverage points. Their desperation was predictable, quantifiable, exploitable. But Barnes went deeper. He identified the weaknesses in the system designed to stop him. Cops who needed money, officials who craved status, judges with secrets. Everyone has a pressure point. Everyone has something they want more than their integrity. Barnes built a network of corrupted officials that would make any Machiavellian prince proud. He didn't bribe randomly, he studied his targets, found their specific vulnerability. Some needed money for gambling debts, some wanted to feel important, some had families they'd do anything to protect. Barnes didn't just pay them off, he owned them. He turned the very system designed to destroy him into his protection mechanism. Cops on his payroll didn't just look the other way. They actively fed him intelligence on investigations, they warned him about raids, they sabotaged cases against him from the inside. This is the Machiavellian principle most people can't stomach. In a world without absolute morality, everything is leverage. Every weakness is an opportunity. Every need is a potential control point. Barnes didn't see corruption as evil. He saw it as the natural state of systems, run by humans with human vulnerabilities. And he was right. The number of officials who took his money, who became complicit in the destruction his heroin caused, it proved his thesis. The moral high ground is a myth maintained by people who haven't been offered the right price. The council structure Barnes created was his masterpiece of insulation. 7 men, each controlling a different territory, each responsible for their own distribution networks. But here's the brilliance. Barnes never touched product. He never handled money directly at the street level. He created what modern corporations would call plausible deniability, what intelligence agencies call compartmentalization. Each layer of his organization knew only what they needed to know. The hand that distributed didn't know the hand that supplied. The hand that collected didn't know the hand that laundered. This wasn't just smart business. This was applied Machiavellian doctrine. Keep your hands clean while others do the necessary dirty work. When the inevitable arrests came, when the raids happened, when the bodies dropped, Barnes was always 3 steps removed. Untouchable. The prince maintains power not by wielding the sword himself, but by ensuring the sword is always in loyal hands that can be disavowed if necessary. Barnes understood something most street criminals never grasp. The closer you are to the violence, the closer you are to prison or death. Distance equals survival. Layers equal longevity. But Barnes didn't just insulate himself operationally. He created legitimate businesses. Car washes, nightclubs, real estate holdings. The classic laundering fronts, yes, but more than that. They were his shield of respectability. When federal investigators looked at Nicky Barnes, they saw a successful businessman, a Harlem entrepreneur. The drugs, prove it. The violence, show me evidence. The empire, I'm just a man who made smart investments. This is the art of the double life, the public face versus the private reality. Machiavelli wrote extensively about appearance versus substance, about the necessity of seeming virtuous while being pragmatically ruthless. Barnes lived this duality. In public, he was Mr. Untouchable, a successful black businessman in an era when such success was rare and celebrated. In private, he was the architect of addiction, the engineer of misery. Both were true. Both were necessary. The legitimate facade made the illegitimate empire possible. Write in the comments which Machiavellian law you think is most dangerous in the hands of someone without conscience. Now we arrive at perhaps the most brutal principle Barnes employed. Crush your enemy totally, not partially, not temporarily, totally. When Frank Lucas emerged as a rival, importing heroin directly from Southeast Asia and cutting into Barnes' market share, Barnes didn't negotiate. He didn't seek compromise. He went to war. But not the way amateurs fight wars. He attacked Lucas's supply lines, his distribution networks, his reputation. He fed information to law enforcement about Lucas's operations while keeping his own protected. He turned Lucas's own people against him. This is the Machiavellian understanding that half measures create future problems. An enemy wounded is an enemy who will recover and return stronger, angrier, more dangerous. An enemy destroyed cannot retaliate. The streets of Harlem became a chessboard where Barnes played for total victory. Every move designed not just to win the current battle, but to ensure there would be no future battles. When you study organized crime, you see this pattern repeatedly. The successful ones, the ones who build lasting empires, they understand that mercy to enemies is cruelty to yourself. It's the weak who leave threats alive. It's the sentimental who create their own future destroyers. The Italian mob learned this about Barnes the hard way, when they tried to muscle into his territory, expecting the usual racial dynamics of the era to work in their favor. Barnes demonstrated something they hadn't anticipated. He was willing to go further than they were. He understood their code, their rules, their limitations, and he exploited every single one. The Italians operated within certain boundaries, certain traditions. Barnes had no such constraints. He was willing to target families. He was willing to create public spectacles of violence that drew attention the Italians desperately avoided. He played a different game with different rules, and that asymmetry gave him advantage. This is advanced strategic thinking. Don't play the enemy's game. Change the rules. Change the battlefield. Make them fight on your terms, by your logic, in your arena. The Italians eventually backed off, not because Barnes was stronger in traditional terms, but because he was unpredictable, unbound by their conventions. Fear comes from uncertainty. Barnes weaponized uncertainty. But perhaps Barnes' most sophisticated manipulation was his control of perception. The Mr. Untouchable persona wasn't an accident. It was engineered. The custom-made suits, the fleet of luxury cars, the beautiful women, the front row seats at Madison Square Garden. This was theater. Psychological warfare. He was creating a mythology, a legend that served multiple strategic purposes. To his community, he was proof that a black man could win in a white man's system. To his enemies, he was an untouchable force of nature. To law enforcement, he was a frustrating ghost they couldn't catch. To his organization, he was the invincible leader worth following. Every public appearance was calculated. Every photograph was propaganda. He understood what politicians and celebrities know. Perception is reality. If people believe you're untouchable, you become harder to touch. If people believe you're powerful, you become more powerful. The image reinforces itself. This is why he drove through Harlem in a custom Mercedes, why he wore chinchilla coats, why he made sure everyone saw him living like royalty. It wasn't ego, not initially. It was strategic. It was the projection of power that creates actual power. The media ate it up. They made him a celebrity, a folk hero to some, a villain to others, but always fascinating, always compelling. Barnes understood that attention could be currency if managed correctly. He gave interviews, he cultivated journalists, he controlled his narrative. When you control the story, you control how people think about you. And how people think about you determines how they act toward you. This is manipulation at the highest level. Not forcing people to do what you want through violence or coercion, but shaping their perception so they naturally do what serves your interests. It's cleaner. It's more sustainable. It's more Machiavellian. But here's where the story takes its darkest turn. where Barnes violated the very principles that had made him successful. Machiavelli warned extensively about trust, about the danger of depending too completely on others, about the necessity of maintaining suspicion even toward those closest to you. Barnes forgot this, or perhaps his ego convinced him he was beyond such concerns. The council, his 7 trusted lieutenants, the men who had built the empire with him, they became his blind spot. He trusted them. Not completely, perhaps, but enough. Enough to be vulnerable. And in that vulnerability, his destruction was born. His wife, his associates, the people who knew the inner workings of his operation, they became informants. They turned. They testified. The very structure he had built, the very people he had empowered, they became the instruments of his downfall. The irony is almost poetic. Barnes had weaponized Machiavelli's principles against everyone around him, but he failed to apply the most crucial principle to himself. Never trust completely. Every person has a breaking point. Every person has a price. Every person will choose self-preservation when the pressure becomes sufficient. The federal government understood this. They applied pressure, they offered deals. They exploited the same human weaknesses Barnes had exploited in others. His council members faced decades in prison. Their families faced poverty, their futures faced destruction. And one by one, they made the rational choice. They saved themselves, just as Barnes had taught them to do. Just as Machiavellian logic would predict, the student became the master's destroyer. Barnes' wife, the woman who shared his bed, who knew his secrets, she turned informant. The betrayal was total. The information she provided was devastating. This is the price of intimacy in a Machiavellian world. Every person you let close is a potential knife aimed at your back. Every secret you share is a potential weapon against you. Love, trust, intimacy. These are vulnerabilities in the game of power. They're exploitable weaknesses. Barnes knew this intellectually, applied it ruthlessly to others, but couldn't fully internalize it in his own life. He was still human, still wanted connection, still believed some bonds were sacred, and that humanity destroyed him. But the final mistake, the ultimate un-Machiavellian error, was the New York Magazine cover. Mr. Untouchable. In bold letters, Barnes in a leather jacket, the story of his empire, spread across pages for millions to read. This was ego overriding strategy. This was the fatal flaw of believing your own mythology. Machiavelli would have been horrified. The successful prince maintains power through calculated obscurity when necessary, through strategic visibility when useful, but never through naked vanity. That magazine cover did what years of police work couldn't do. It made Barnes a priority. It put him on the federal government's radar in a way that demanded response. President Carter himself reportedly saw the cover and demanded action. You cannot humiliate power publicly and expect no consequences. You cannot flaunt your untouchability and remain untouchable. The fall was swift. The arrests, the trials, the convictions, the empire dismantled. The council destroyed. Barnes himself facing life in prison. And in the ultimate reversal, Barnes did what his associates had done to him. He became an informant. He cooperated. He testified against former allies. He sent dozens to prison. The man who had built an empire on loyalty and fear ended up betraying everyone to save himself. Some call this hypocrisy. But through a Machiavellian lens, it's perfect consistency. Survival above all. Self-interest as the highest law. No principle worth dying for when you can live by abandoning it. Barnes played the game to the end, just from a different position.